In this screencast, we'll be learning how you can use Angular to build single-page web applications like Gmail. So this is the application that we'll be building, where the data is coming from a JSON API and the state changes in the UI are defined in the HTML and JavaScript. The first thing we'll do is download the starter project from the start branch. CD into there and run npm start, which will fetch our dependencies and start a local server. So leaving that server running in a separate process, we'll run npm run assets, which will compile all of the SAS and CoffeeScript whenever we make changes. Then we should be able to hit localhost 8000 in the browser and see a static version of this page. In index.html we have static HTML for the list of threads, thread detail, and a compose new message window. And right at the bottom we've included Angular.js, 3 other Angular projects, and some blank files where we'll be writing our new code. All you need to do to start using Angular is include this script and add an nGmail attribute somewhere in the document that you want to be able to put Angular expressions. So we can start adding dynamic content into the page. So things in here can be any JavaScript statement. Then when we refresh the page in the browser, we'll see our dynamic title. So let's get rid of that, and in ng-app we'll pass the name of the module that all our JavaScript will go in. We'll call that nGmail. And then in app.coffee create app variable global equals angular.module, pass it in nGmail, and then a list of dependencies that we're going to need to use in our app, which we don't have any yet. Now that we have our app module, we can start putting things into there like controllers and directives. So this list of threads, we want to get the data from our controller, so we can pass ng-controller name, and then in controllers.coffee create a controller on our app module called threads, and we'll pass it a function. So this function will get run when Angular initializes this view, this controller. And we pass in any dependencies as arguments to this function. So we need to pass in a scope variable, which is how we push data back to the view. And we'll also pass in the HTTP dependency so we can fetch threads from our API. So on scope, we're going to create an empty array of threads, and using HTTP, we're going to get from our JSON API the list of threads. So API threads index.json, and then when that returns, we will have our data. So we can assign that. And let's log it out to see how far we've gone. And refreshing this in the browser, we should see requests being made. So our API, returning our 3 records. Nice. So we've got our data now, and now we can start building out our view. So in index.html, our list of threads, we're going to repeat this list item for every thread. And we can do that through an ng-repeat attribute. And then we pass thread in threads. Now this threads variable that we're accessing here, we have access to because we've passed it through scope. So anything on scope in here we can access through curly braces or through these Angular directive attributes. time, we can start using just properties of our thread. So if we have a look at the data, the thread has message count, its unread status, a list of participants, and details of the last message. So in our view, we can start accessing thread.lastMessage.createdAt thread.lastMessage.subject and thread.lastMessage.snippet, and using our ngRepeat again, we can loop through the list of person in people, and then we can print out their names. There it is. So we've got timestamps. This content is dynamic. We don't have any names for some reason, so I must have done something wrong there. So these people is meant to be thread participants. And there we go. Let's add a space to the end of our names, so that they're space separated, as well as adding a message count in round brackets after the names. And these unread classes we can apply with an ng class attribute, and then we pass a hash with the class name and then an expression. So this can be thread.unread, and if thread is unread, it will get that class. If not, it won't. And we'll do the same thing for our list of people down here. So if someone sent you a message and you haven't just seen one person's message, then they'll show up in bold. So we can access person.unread off this loop. And this will play nicely with the regular class attribute. So in the case where it's unread, it will add both name and unread to the class, and when it's read, it'll just be name. Let's try that out. And that works. So now we have unread threads with the white background and unread people in this thread in bold. Now, not many people use timestamps as their date formats, so let's format that. And we can use a filter to do this. So you tack filters on to the end of any expression with a pipe, and you pass it a name, and then any arguments separated by colons. So date can take a format. So month, day will render those nicely. And Gmail does even better than this by when the date is less than 1 day old, it returns a time format, and else it returns this format. So we'll create a new custom filter in filters.coffee called SmartDate to do this. So app.filter SmartDate, and it takes a function with any dependencies in here. So we want to reuse Angular's date filter, so we can pass in filter, and this filter is going to take a date, a timestamp, and 1 day old equals date.now minus 1 day in milliseconds. And if the date is greater than 1 day old, we want to use this inbuilt filter. So we'll save a reference to just the date filter, and we'll use this format. So we pass in timestamp, and when the date is greater than 1 day, or we want to use times. So hours, hours, minutes, minutes, n, and else we want to use month, 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 day, day. And then we can use this filter by just passing in smart date as the filter, which takes no arguments. And when we test that out, nothing changes because the data is all in the past. There's nothing from today, so we'll update the data to a new timestamp. And when we refresh the page, we should see so n isn't right. That n needs to be an a to return AM, PM. And when we refresh, get a nice time and date. Gmail also has some nice touches with the formatting of names here. So in the case where there's only one thread, it will display the full name, and in the case where there's multiple people, it will only display their first names. It will comma separate them all, and it will only show this message count if there's more than one. And it also replaces the current logged in user with me. So let's make a custom filter to do this. So we'll make a smart name filter, doesn't need any dependencies. Take a person object, and then we want to be able to test if the person is the current logged in user. So the way I do this is just right at the bottom of the body, just whack expose a global object for current user. And I do this because I want to be able to access this data in many parts of the app, and it's just easier not to have to pass it around everywhere. So we'll put that there. And then in our filter we can test if the person's email is the current user's email. Then we want to return me. Else we'll return the person's full name. And we'll trim that too, just to, in the case where there's no last name, it'll just display nicely. So we can start using this filter by passing it in here. So pass in smart name, pass in the person object to the smart name filter. So let's test this out. It's replaced me with me. Looks good. Let's comma separate these names now. So we can do that inside loops. There's a couple of variables that get created that we can use. So things like first, last, or index, we can test inside the loop if it's the first item, if it's the last item, or if it's a specific number. So we can test if it's the last time through the loop, we want to output nothing, else we want to output commas. But the problem is that where we want to put this in the HTML is outside of this loop, so it won't work. And we want to put it outside of this span because the span gets formatting applied. So because we don't want the comma to be bold, we need it after. So what we actually need to do is move this nGrepeat higher. So we'll just create a new span and wrap this name in there with the comma and close it. And testing that out. So commas, and we've got one extra space in here. And there it is. Let's also pass in if we want full names or single names to our smart filter, so that in this case when there's more than one person in the thread, we only want to display their first names. So we can pass a value into our filter, thread.messageCount equals 1, and then our filter will take an extra parameter in here and it'll be full name. We can set a default to false with CoffeeScript, and we only want to display the full name if that's true. Else, we just want to return just first name. And Beatrix is gone. The last thing we'll do is hide this message count in the case where there's only one message in the thread. So we can do this using an ngShow attribute. And we want that to show when the message count is greater than 1. And it goes away. We can also use the inverse, ngHide, in case where it's 1, which will do the same thing. And this works by adding a ngHide class to that attribute. So it's still in the DOM, and it's just got display none from applied through the CSS. The inbox is almost there. Let's also update the selected states of these when we check these checkboxes. So let's do that in here, an ngClick attribute. And we've got direct access to any variables on scope. So we've got our thread, and we can change a selected attribute. And the inverse, so that will toggle that property on our thread. And we can apply a selected class based on that value. And that's as hard as it is. So this is the first example of two-way binding that we've seen. So the classes are getting dynamically applied whenever the underlying data changes, and we're also able to push changes to our data through those attributes. So it's quite powerful. You might feel a little bit dirty putting this sort of behavior logic in the HTML, but I found it to require a lot less code, and so if you feel that way, just persist with it and see how it feels. So we're ready for our second view now. So we've built out our inbox threads here, and we'll move on to the thread detail view. So we'll put each of these into their own views. So we'll move threads into partials threads. And we'll move the thread detail into thread. And we'll show that content. And in index, to mark this content div as the view where these partials go, we add ngView into there. So now we'll need to load these depending on the route. So to configure our router, we need to pass in ngroute. Now, this is this other package that we included from the start. So routing isn't part of the default Angular framework. You need to include it manually if you want to include routing. So because we've got that there, we can pass it in here, and we configure that router object through the route provider. And then we say route provider, when it's the inbox, we want these properties. So you can set a template URL to load these partials. So partials threads.html and when it's threads ID, so it supports dynamic segments in these URLs. We want to load just thread. You can also say otherwise. We want it to redirect to the inbox. So it's redirected to hash inbox. So by default it uses this hash routing, and that's what we'll be using in this tutorial. And now if we load threads #1, it will load our second view, and back and forward works. Let's look closer at what's going on here. If we inspect and load the console, when we load this threads HTML partial, Angular is making an AJAX request to grab that content. Now this is a pretty nice default. It means that when we click through, we don't need to, and we can see there that it's cached that response as well and reused it. So that's a nice default. Another way that you can do it is rather than passing a URL, you can pass it a string of HTML as well. So if we wanted to bootstrap one of these templates and not make an AJAX request for it, we can just pass it directly in. So this is using CoffeeScript's multi-line syntax, which is pretty nice. And now when we view our list of threads, we can see it's not making that extra request for the HTML, just the data. And there you go. So there's two options. We'll make a controller for our thread detail view now. So on our thread, nGcontroller, thread controller, controls.coffee. So now scope, we'll make a request for that data, and we'll also grab wrap params for grabbing the dynamic ID off the URL. And here we're going to set scope.thread to an empty hash. I'm going to fetch the API threads params.id JSON, and when that's successful, we'll have our data. Okay, and then we can start putting in details from our API. So let's have a look at one of them. And so it has a list of messages, and each one has from person, an array of people that it's to, unread, subject, snippet, and body created at. So let's start using this. Messages, we'll just look at the first one, and we'll say subject. And we'll view that. And it's got Bill. Fox Force 5, joke. Cool. To save time here, we'll just paste in the thread detail view, because there's not much new in here that we haven't already seen. We're looping through each message in the thread, talking an active class, formatting the dates using smart date, showing these controls if the message is active, displaying an avatar of the person that's from, and displaying their name, email, with a list of any other people that it's to. And if the message is active, we want to show the full message, otherwise we just want to show the snippet. So when it's not active, it has its collapsed view. So let's try this out. Okay, so there's our dynamic content, and we can see something funky going on with our images here. Now this 404 isn't actually this image here. It's from this one. So this image in here, what happens is this HTML is getting sent to the browser when it loads, and Angular hasn't had a chance to override this source attribute to include the dynamic part here. So the browser actually just makes a request straight away for that URL, and that's what we're seeing in the message here. So message.fromAvatar, that's what it's actually looking for. So to fix this problem, we need to use ngSource, which is designed just for getting around that problem, and we won't get that request there now. This current user's avatar, we want to be able to use current user again in the scope, but we don't always want to have to pass it through, so it's current user with the capital is a variable, a global on window, but we can't access it through the scope object. So what we want to do is in app.coffee right at the start, app.run lets you run a function that gives you access to dependencies as well. So root scope is an object which all scopes inherit from, and we can assign current user there. And then our thread will be able to access current user.avatar, and there's my face. Continuing with this view, we'll just output time ago with message.created@, and a new filter called time ago. And I'll just paste this one in here to save time as well. You can study this one later. It just compares the current date timestamp and works out how many seconds, minutes, hours, days have passed. When we view this in the browser, we'll see a nice relative time. Let's look at the active states for messages in this thread now. So when a thread is active, we display the full body HTML as well as controls up here. And Gmail by default opens up the last message in the thread, and it doesn't allow you to close it. So we'll add an ngClick attribute onto each message, and we'll toggle active message. So this will be a method on our scope. And it will take a message. And when we request our data, then we can save the last message in a variable. Data.messages. Just one. And we activate that last one. And need to save that up here. And then in this method, we want to compare, unless it's the last one, which we don't want to close. It's the message.id equals last message.id. And then we'll toggle active. So we'll test that out. Review. So it's activated it. And we've got our control and the HTML content, and when we click, it doesn't close it. And if we view one of the other views, you can see the inactive states, and you can toggle them. And this one, you can't. So that's all working. Angular is protecting us from cross-site scripting here by encoding any HTML tags in the output by default. So if you want to output HTML, we can't use the curly braces. but there is an ng bind HTML attribute that says this content is expected to be HTML, and when we pass that in, refresh, it will tell us that we're trying to output HTML content. So in index.html, we've actually included a special library, an extension of Angular called Sanitize, and we can pass that into app.coffee as a dependency to start using that. And that will say that HTML, it will sanitize the HTML before its output. So now when we refresh, we've got our HTML content. So jumping back to our list of threads, we've actually introduced a bug. When we click on the checkboxes, it's changing that state and then navigating to the link underneath. So we introduced this when we added these links. So the span for the checkbox is inside here, and we no longer get to toggle these. So let's fix that. Now there's a few ways to do this, but it'll give us a chance to look at directives. So directives are either attributes or elements that you want to be able to attach behavior to. So we could create a stop event directive, which is a function that'll run that will enable that behavior that we want. So on directives.coffee, we can create a new directive of app called stop event. So the names here are camel cased, whereas the name in the attributes are snake cased. Again, we pass dependencies in here, which we don't have any yet, and directives return an object with some special properties on here. So restrict A means it's an attribute, and if we were creating a new HTML tag that we want to use, we can pass E for element. But stop event is an attribute, and there's a link method which runs just after this content is in the page, and it means it's safe to start attaching events to. So the properties that are passed in here are a local scope, the element, and attributes. So we can use element.bind on click. We want to call this function, and we want to prevent the default and stop propagation. And let's test this out. Nothing. Event.stop propagation. Okay, I spelled it wrong. Propagation. And there we go. So directives are for sharing behavior among different elements that you repeat throughout your application. So one other place we could use a directive is for our drop-downs. So in our index.html, there's a drop-down control, and when we click on it, we want to toggle an active class in here. So rather than using a div, we can create a new HTML element that describes our behavior. Drop down, and in our directives coffee file, it'll be almost the same as this one. It'll be called drop down, and it's going to be an element, and when we click on that element, we want to toggle the class. Now, we can use Angular.element as a wrapper around jQlite. If jQuery is included in the page, that'll be jQuery. If not, it uses its own light version. So the APIs aren't exactly the same, but it does have the same toggle class method, which will And there it is. Easy. So we'll learn about Angular's services next. And we'll be using a service for our thread model, so that we can pass in thread as a dependency here and then start querying our API from that method without having to manually set up these URLs. So in index.html we've already included Angular resource, which is an extension specifically for querying REST APIs. So we can pass that in as a dependency to app.coffee here, and then in our services.coffee we can create a factory for thread. So factory creates a singleton object. So a singleton is an object that we can just call methods on, like get or query, without having to instantiate it. So that works for our models, and we want to pass in $resource to give us that Angular resource service, and we can call resource with the URL of our API, so API threads and id.json. Now the second parameter is default parameters, default arguments to this, and we can set the ID to index, which will, if we call this, if we query this without an ID, it'll grab index.json, and if we do pass an ID of 1, then we'll get 1.json. So that's what we need at this stage for our models. And in controls.coffee we can start including that directly there, and rather than doing this we can use a much nicer syntax, a much nicer API query. And down here we can use thread.get, and we can pass ID and the callback. So we no longer need these HTTP dependencies, so we can get rid of those and test it out, and it still works. So now we've got a much nicer queryable models. We'll look at this submenu states next, and we'll work on the paging first. So this is the HTML that we want to edit, and we could create separate controllers for this, but the threads controller really has the data that we'll need. So what we'll do is we'll just promote, we'll move this HTML, we'll move the controller from here, from just the being the list, into the whole wrapper, and then we can use that threads controller's scope anywhere in this document, anywhere down to here, so excluding this compose section. So now we can, in our controller, we can assign some paging attributes in here. And it's a little bit silly because we won't have a backend to do this for us, so we'll just say from is always 1, 2 will be the length of the data, and the count will be the length of the data as well. And then we can include those in here. Paging.count, and then if we refresh, that's coming from the threads controller now. The back to index button here, we only want to display when it isn't the index route. So we need a way of checking that, and we can put it on to root scope because this helper is going to be helpful in lots of pages. So is route active, take a route, and it will just compare if the route is equal to the current active route. So it's a location dependency and location service that we can include to get the current path, which will do what we want. And then in index, it's back to index, back to inbox, we can hide that if active box. And there we go. It's only there when we are on this detail view. This drop down for toggling the selected states in our threads we'll look at next. So we're going to need a bunch of functions on our threads controller that will toggle these states. So I'll just paste these in here because they're quite repetitive. But we have select all, select none, select unread, select read. Sum selected returns true if at least one of the threads is selected. None selected, make sure that there isn't any. All selected checks that they're all selected, and toggle selected. If some are selected, it will select none, else select all. So let's start using these. On the checkbox itself is ngClick can call toggle selected. And let's try this out. So this one here. Okay, so we can put the stop event directive that we created before in here, so that when we check that checkbox, it doesn't open up this menu, which will be helpful. And select all, select none, red. Nice, it's all working. The display of this button here, so it has different icons for when some are selected and when all is selected. So we want to set different classes up here. It's actually on the checkbox itself. ng class has an all selected when all is selected, and some selected, some selected. Because I've got the dashes in these, I need quotes. And there we go, we've got our checkbox, and it changes to a dash when we've just got some selected. So if we click that in that state, it unchecks them. Nice. These three buttons here, archive, spam, trash, are only displayed when there's some items selected in the threads, or on the thread detail page, and the refresh button is only there when we don't have items selected, or we're on the inbox page. So let's add that logic in here. So we want to show these controls when there are some selected, or is route active, or when the route isn't active, inbox, and the refresh button. We want to show that only when we're on the inbox page and there are none selected. that out. ng show. Okay, so no items are selected, the refresh button shows, and these buttons go away. We toggle, we can see these three buttons, and when we view the detail, we get these buttons back as well. We also want to hide this button, so drop down. We only ever want to show on the inbox page. And there we go. We can wire up a client-side fuzzy search, so when people type in Beatrix, it will just filter out these two messages and show those very easily in Angular. So this input, we have a new attribute that we haven't seen before called nGmail, which ties this inputs value to a property on scope. So if we just put in nGmail query, whenever this input changes, query will be updated to have the latest query. So our list of threads and threads, we can filter this with a filter named filter, and we can pass in the query, and that's it. So look for Bud, and there he is. So that is the easiest client-side fuzzy search you'll ever see. And it's a bit silly doing it for this application because this is going to have to be done server-side to search across multiple pages, but I just wanted to demo this feature. We'll work on this new message window now. So when we click this compose button, we want to launch this and we can hide it. When we click send, it will show a sending message in the flash up the top, and after a timer we'll hide that. Okay, so we'll add a controller for this, compose, and we only want to show this element when it's visible. So we'll add close in here, so close method, and send method. Okay, create that controller. And it will have access to scope, and we'll set visible to false as a default. And we want to launch this from this compose button here. So things get interesting because this is inside our threads controller, and we want to change state on another controller. So the way we can do that is through events on root scope, because both of these scopes will have access to it. So when we click the compose button, we want to fire a compose message function, and then in our threads, we can add that there. And this will need access to root scope. And there's a $run method, sorry, broadcast method for sending the message. And we can just give it a name. So compose message. And then in our compose controller, we can also pass through root scope. And on is the listener. So $on compose message, we want to toggle the visible. I'll set it to active rather. And just to note that these dollars, all they do is it's a naming convention for Angular methods, Angular properties, services. So you know that when you're doing a dollar function or property, it's an Angular thing. So that should now work. We'll test that out. So it's false by default and hidden. Compose launches it. Nice. We can hide that. So we have that close button already firing a close method on scope. And we can set the visible to false. And we'll also add a send method in here, which will do the same for now. So compose to launch. That one's not working. So compose controller close. Index. ng click. And that one's right. And that's working. And send does the same. Great. Another example of when we'll need a shared scope is with this flash message. So lots of places in this app will need access to change this and show that. So we'll create a controller for this and call it flash. We only want to display this when it's visible, or we can set the message's length is greater than 0. Create that controller. And we're going to want to pass in an object here, which we can also include throughout the app, which will be the data model for our flash message. So we'll set that on scope. And then that object will have a message property. So that'll be there. Okay, and this flash object will create a service for. So just like our threads, it'll be a factory, flash, and all that we'll have is a empty message by default. So it's just a singleton object, so it's the equivalent of this. That's what we're doing there. But because it's a factory, because it's a service, we can pass it around and then set those properties. So when we compose and we send, we want to set pass in flash here. And then we can set that message property equal to sending. And let's see if this works. So it's not being hidden. Gcontroller, show flash message dot length. Is there any errors? Scope is not defined. Thank you. So the error messages are pretty helpful in Angular. They lead you straight to the problem. So when we hit send, we get our message. Great. We want to hide it after a short time, so we can set timeout. And after a second, we just want to set that. Sorry, I'm in the wrong spot here. When we send that message, we want to set timeout and then set the flash's message back to blank. And it's not going away. And that's because set timeout is broken in Angular. we can't change scopes and have them be updated in the view because it loses reference to those. So we actually need to use a special method in Angular which does the same thing, and it keeps track of scopes, so that when we change this property, it will get updated. But it's a dependency, so we'll need to pass that one in. And there it is. And here's what the finished compose controller looks like. So we have a reset method at the top, which resets the default state. So we hide the popover and we set all the active states to empty. Then we set the from person back to the primary account. And whenever we close or send a message, we reset that state as well. So the view is also filled in, and when the to input has focus, we set the active section to 2, and we show all these extra controls. So we show the to, the CC, the BCC, and the from fields. And when the active section isn't to, we just display recipients. So that's nice. And yeah, subject and body, pretty simple. And here's what that looks like. So we have CC and BCC that when we click these, we toggle those to be active, and when we lose, when the to input isn't focused, this drops back to recipients. And they're bound with ng models, so when we input data in here, it's shared between these two views. So that input there and this input are actually different fields, but their state is shared. So that property there can be accessed in both views. And when we hit send and compose, it's reset. The final piece that we'll add here is around the focus states of these inputs. So when we first launch the compose window, we want this to field to be focused and at different points. So when we show this CC button, we want to focus on there, and BCC, same deal. So we can make a directive to do that, and we'll call it focus when, and we pass in timeout as dependency, and in the link function, meaning that this element is rendered and we can start messing with it, we use scope.watch. And this watches this attribute for changes. So this focus when will be an expression that we pass in to this attribute. So this will be, just restrict this just to attributes. And whenever this value changes, if the value is truthy, then we'll, inside a timeout, we'll set focus on that element. And the timeout's just there to move this focus to the end of the call stack, so that it fires after everything else. So that if it's being shown at the time, it'll wait for it to be shown and then it'll focus. So we can start using this focus when directive in our compose view. So we want to focus on this to field, focus when the active section equals 2. And this one is when CC is active. And this one's BCC active. So this will listen to these fields for changes. So when we set BCC to active true when we click on this BCC field. This div will be shown, and after all that's happened, after the timeout, focus when BCC active will be true, and it should get focus. And here's what it looks like. So we now have focus, and CC, BCC, it all works. The final thing I need to mention is to do with compression. So in gulp.file.js, if we include an uglify step in our script's compilation and restart that task, then when we refresh, we'll start getting all these errors. And that's to do with how we've implemented dependency injection. So it's renamed the name of these variables everywhere that we've passed them in. So anytime we've been using dependency injection, we've been just listing them as arguments. And Angular's actually used those names of the variables to find which dependency you want to inject. So compression is stuffed, and the only way to fix this is to add a really nasty array of names to the start here. So we double up these, double up this list, and the function is the last argument. And we need to close that array down here. So this is really nasty having to do this because the variables change. We can no longer change the order of these around. We need to maintain both places. But when this is compiled, these strings will stay as they are, and just these variables will get renamed. So compression will work just fine. So if you wanted to go through our app and update all these so that compression works, I'll leave that as a task for you. And that's all I have for you. I hope you found some of this tutorial helpful and you enjoy using Angular.